KN Public. Oh, there we go. Now we're recording. My name's Ed Ronco. I'm the news director at Interlochen Public Radio. Before I was here just this past summer, I was at KNKX Public Radio in Seattle, where I spent many years as the anchor of All Things Considered in the afternoon. And then before that, I worked for the South Bend Tribune in Indiana. That was my first full-time job in journalism. So I've been in newspapers and public radio, and I think we'll get to hear some of our other panelists' backgrounds in the industry as well. Looking forward to hearing some of their experiences. Before I introduce the panel, I want to talk a little bit about just how this event will work. We're going to have a conversation with each other. It's pretty casual. We're just going to talk about some of the things we've experienced in the business, some questions we have for each other. People will, nobody needs to be called on me necessarily. If you want to jump in with something and you have something to add, please do. And we will just have a chat. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you're following along on the webinar, and that is the place to ask a question. If you see a chat button, don't use that. We won't be paying attention to that. So if you want to ask a question, use that Q&A button and you can type in your question, and we'll try to incorporate those as we go this morning and get to as many of those as possible. Again, use that Q&A button. So let's jump in. I have some introductions to share about all the panelists. Hey, Jakob Wheeler, good to see you. Let's start with David Zeman. He is a senior editor for Bridge, Michigan. And actually, as I introduce you, if you could just wave, I know our names are in our tiles, but that's helpful too. Yeah, thanks, David. Senior editor for Bridge, Michigan, 2 decades at the Detroit Free Press as a reporter and editor, among other things in his career. His work as an editor earned many awards, including one you might have heard of called the Pulitzer Prize for 2009 coverage, in 2009 for coverage of Kwame Kilpatrick and the end of his mayorship and some of the things that happened there. Definitely a story that most of us in Michigan know. Yeah, David, it's great to have you on the panel. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Mardi Link is with us, enterprise reporter for the Traverse City Record-Eagle. And I wrote, Marty, that your career has been bookended by newspapers, and I mean that quite literally, because you're an author of books, and you had newspapers before, and you're with the newspaper now, and there were books in the middle. You've written several of them, including an award-winning memoir, Bootstrapped, and a New York Times bestselling true crime book, Wicked Takes the Witness Stand. Marty, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks.
John Elchert is with us. I got to know John when he was publisher of the Leelanau Enterprise, and I say was, but only recently, because in the last week or so, you've gotten a new job title, Chief Operating Officer of the parent company of the Enterprise, which has 30 community newspapers. Good news for us is that you're staying in Leelanau County, and I understand that your career in journalism, your career in newspapers began on the sales and marketing side, circulation, ad sales, ad director. And John, it's great to have you with us. It was fun to co-host the Cherry Pie debates this fall, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say today.
Excellent. Thanks, Ed.
Victoria Alfonseca is with us, editor of GTB News, a publication of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. She's held that position since, is this correct, fall of 2021?
That is correct.
Yeah, and before that, social media manager for Warriors for Wireless and program manager for HiveMind Internet Cooperative. And you also volunteer, I understand, I felt compelled to include this. You volunteer with Traverse City Roller Derby?
Yeah, I actually used to roller derby, so I got a little feisty side in me too.
I would be wildly remiss if I did not ask you for your derby name.
Okay, so it's Notorious VIC. I'm pretty notorious around here.
Excellent, thank you. Jakob Wheeler is here, editor and publisher and founder of the Glen Arbor Sun. They publish biweekly in the summer, monthly in the off season, and you also work with journalism students at Northwestern Michigan College. You freelance. I don't need to tell you this, but for the benefit of others, you're an author as well. You recently had your second book published, which is called Angel of the Garbage Dump. We had an interview about that on IPR. It was a fascinating story about an American woman who started a school for children near the Guatemala City garbage dump. Jakob, thanks for being here.
Ed, it's an honor. Thanks so much for having this.
And Jillian Manning, your first career was also in books, editing children's books. You said that you loved that job, but it took you away from Traverse City, your beloved hometown. So you and your husband moved back in 2018. You freelanced for the Northern Express, and you must have been good because they made you the editor.
Nope.
So you're the editor there now, and you also are a former executive director of the National Writers Series. So it's great to have you with us as well.
Thank you.
So I want to go around the panel, and I think maybe Mardi, we can start with you. We've sort of sketched out biographies here, but I'm curious, what got you into journalism, and perhaps also what keeps you in journalism, because it is not easy work.
Oh, sure. So when I was growing up, I was always, the kid with the notebook, spying on my neighbors and writing down what they were doing, and then sharing that information with others. And yet in my mind, when I got accepted to Michigan State, my plan was to go to vet school. I thought I was going to be a veterinarian. And my father, who's an educator, my mother, who's an educator, would sort of casually tell their friends, she's going to be a writer. It was like they knew me better than myself, even in my late teens. And so I did go to state. I took a lot of biology and science classes, go Spartans, and then eventually switched to communications and then journalism. Actually, I studied agriculture and natural resources and journalism together. And I guess I think of myself as a generalist, and we are a dying breed, and we are in short supply. And there's no place better than local news if you consider yourself a generalist, because there are so many stories that are not being told. And if you're interested in many things, hopefully some of those at least won't escape our focus or our gaze. So that got me into journalism. I then wrote books because that was more conducive to having children and staying home with my kids. And then back in, I think, 2016, 2017, I began to get incredibly weary of hearing the business that I loved be disparaged. And I'm not in a position to relocate, even if some other large paper would have me. So luckily enough, my local paper hired me, and I decided, instead of just complaining about the criticism, I would participate. And I was not sure if I could still, I guess, casually, I'll say, hack it. I didn't know if I still had new sense. I didn't know if I still had the energy or the determination or the drive. And I think I still do. So that's what's kept me here.
Well, as a reader of the Record Eagle, I will say, yes, you certainly still do. I'm always glad to see your byline in the paper. Thanks, Mardi. David, how'd you get into journalism, and why do you stay?
Well, I got into journalism because I wanted to be Dustin Hoffman and All the President's Men, like a lot of people of my age, I guess. I was a lawyer first. I was a commercial litigation lawyer in Miami, Florida, and just it was good. It was fun, but I missed the sort of I didn't have the metabolism for waiting 4 or 5 months for someone to answer interrogatory questions and all that sort of stuff. I love being in court hearings, but I didn't like the day-to-day back and forth. And journalism, I always thought I'd combine law and journalism in one way or another. I clerked for a First Amendment firm down there. But after a couple of years of being a lawyer in Miami, I decided and reading the newspaper, when my boss wasn't around, I decided, and being around the Miami Herald and all the great journalists and all the fun stories that they were doing in South Florida, I just decided I'd rather be a journalist. And so I applied as like a 26-year-old to Columbia journalism program, the master's program, and got in and took on some more debt. And I felt like when in my first newsroom, which was in Raleigh, North Carolina, I just felt like, these are my people, I just felt like I belonged there. And even though I was greener in a lot of respects than a lot of the people I was working with, I just felt this is where I want to be. These are the people I like hanging out with. This is the kind of trouble, I wanted to make. And so, so that's what I've done. And then I went to Miami, and then I went to Detroit, and now I'm here at Bridge. And I went to Bridge. I didn't go to Bridge directly, but I wanted to get out about 10 years ago from sort of being in a big corporate newspaper like, Gannett. And I saw myself as being in my early 50s and, even with the Kwame stuff and doing well and all that, I could see myself in 5. I didn't want to just sit back and wait to see if Gannett was just going to be cutting people over a certain age, or a certain salary and so forth. So I wanted to do something entrepreneurial and be in a spot where I could actually grow something. And I was given an opportunity to do that at Bridge, and we had like 1.5 reporters when I started, and now we have like 10. We had, we relied on mostly really good freelancers like Jakob and a lot of others. And we've been able to slowly expand, and the nonprofit sort of environment that we're in has just been really rejuvenating for me, and I think for the folks who work there.
And for folks, who hear the word Gannett, of course, this is the giant Virginia-based company that owns the Detroit Free Press and countless other papers around the country. And I think just this week announced that they would be making further reductions in their operations. And we've seen Gannett lay off many journalists over the last several years. And the future, who knows what's in store there. I understand that sentiment totally. Victoria, let's go to you. What got you in? What keeps you in?
Well, I think I was preparing for this moment when I was 15. I didn't even realize it. I grew up in Northern Michigan. This is my home. This will always be my home. This is where my heart is. I was going to design school at TBA Career Tech Center, and I started in that design aspect of creativity and journalism, I would suppose, creating the image for the paper. So I did an internship with my tribe. I'm a tribal member with the Glen Arbor Band. When I was about 15, it was a paid internship. I don't know how I did that, but I was 15 going to school in high school and going to design school. And I had a paid internship that was kind of bizarre because at that age, really, you're working for free at that point. So then I kind of, I went through this phase of like, I don't really know what I want to be when I grow up. I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to do all these things. So I changed my major quite a bit. And then finally, I had an opportunity to work with the gaming side of operations and marketing. So that kind of sparked the flame for me. I knew I wanted to be around people. I was always comfortable creating conversations, doing public relations stuff. I started doing speaking engagements when I was about 15. I was traveling all over the United States playing sports and doing speaking arrangements. So I knew I wanted to be something to deal with a lot of people communicating. So I went to school at Ferris, got a couple degrees, and things just kind of lined up for me. I came back home and these opportunities just kind of fell in front of me. I'm not sure why, but then I started to work at the Glen Arbor Band as a multimedia specialist. And then immediately it was like, boom, I was now the editor. It just kind of rolled into place so well for me. I mean, I'm so grateful for all of those things that just kind of put in my path to allow me to take those opportunities. So that's kind of where I started at 15, and it kind of, now I'm running the department that I interned at. So it's just kind of mind blowing to me that it all happened when I was so young.
Yeah, that's great. John Elchert, let's go to you. What's your story about getting in and staying in the business?
Thank you, Ed, and thanks to the League of Women Voters and Leelanau Indivisible. This is a great opportunity for the community. I literally am one of those that fell into the business. Went to school at the University of Toledo. Go Rockets, everyone. And have a degree in education. I wanted to be a teacher and a coach. And in the, date myself here, in the early 80s, it was hard to find teaching jobs. And I grew up, and across the street, my neighbor was the publisher of the local newspaper. And one of my high school teachers and coaches left teaching and became the circulation director at our local hometown newspaper. And I was at the university working on a master's degree because I couldn't find a teaching job. And he called me out of the blue one night and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And so I went down and interviewed, and it went well. And they asked me what I knew about the newspaper business. I said, ever since I can remember as a small kid, I read one every day. And then in my junior high days, I delivered a paper. Other than that, I don't know anything about the business. And they hired me. So they took a chance on me way back then. I started as a circulation director, did that for 4 or 5 years, became advertising director, did that for 7 or 8 years, then became publisher, all at my hometown paper in Tiffin, Ohio. And so I'm a Ohio sports fan, which other than the Buckeyes, it's been a pretty depressing life following the other Ohio teams. But so I moved from Ohio to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, spent 9 winters there, moved to Western Pennsylvania for the same company, spent 5 years there, went to New Mexico, Farmington, New Mexico, which is a beautiful place. Stayed there about 5 years, went to Minnesota for a couple of years, then back to Michigan, down in Adrian, most recently before I moved to Leelanau. And that was a Gatehouse paper down in Adrian, Gatehouse, now Gannett combined. So I've lived in that world for a while, and I'm glad to be in the world I'm in right now. I work for a company out of Buffalo, Wyoming, a young man, 36 years old. His family owned newspapers. Him and his brother own newspapers. He has 31 newspapers now. He bought 10 in the last year, and he hopes to continue that growth. And what he's doing is going into small markets and buying papers that are really in jeopardy of closing down. And he believes wholeheartedly in local news coverage, local newspapers. He knows the value to the communities of providing local news. The news you can't get anywhere else. And that's our mission, is to provide local news coverage for our community, to keep people informed of what's going on, but also stories about the good people in the community. So I've been here maybe 5 years in October, that I've been working for. His name is Louis Mullen, just a wonderful family, a great guy to work for.
Great. Thanks, John. Jillian Manning, children's books to journalism. Let's talk about how you made that switch and what keeps you in the business.
Yeah, well, Marty really reminded me, I wouldn't have thought of this, but I too spied on my neighbors. I actually asked my mom to call me Harriet, as in Harriet the Spy, according to my first grade journal, and she refused. Then I tried Matilda. She said no to that too, so I was really out of luck. But I had, one of those marbled notebooks and everything. And so I was keeping track of my own life, interesting as it was or was not at that time, for a long time. And then I was a huge reader. I mean, I liked school, I liked learning, I liked that environment, but all I wanted to do was read. Put me in front of a science project and I can do it, but only if there's really good instructions to help me along the way. So I knew I wanted to do something in the writing realm, went to U of M, and was oscillating between, I was an English major, as is my husband. So tell your children English majors can do it. We had to, kind of a program about editing, and I got into that. And then I learned that you could actually go and be a book publisher. And you didn't have to live in New York, because that was a deal breaker for small town girl me. I was like, I can't make it there. I've got to be kind of at least a little bit in the Midwest. So I did a stint in Denver, some time in Chicago, and then in Grand Rapids, working for different publishers and getting some more degrees and things like that. And I wrote a couple of books for Sesame Street along the way, so I know a lot about Elmo. If you have any questions, let me know. But yeah, I think, like you said in the intro, my husband and I are both from TC. We really wanted to get back here. And so I took a sort of hard left from being a children's book editor to being a public relations manager at Grand Traverse Resort and Spa, and then Traverse City Tourism. So still storytelling, but I was missing, it was promotional. I was missing kind of like, what's the dark side? Even though I'm not the dark side person, I was like, there's got to be at least a little bit of a dark side. And so meanwhile, I was freelancing for the Express, and about a year ago, February of last year, took on the editor role. And I will say we are a primarily bright side paper, but every once in a while I get a fun little dark side story. So it's, I think for me, to be living where I want to live, telling the stories about the place that I love, the people, the businesses. I'm especially passionate about environmental issues and social justice issues, and being able to, find those in our hometown and share that is a really, it's just a really wonderful thing to be able to do that I never would have predicted. My husband and I were talking the other day. We didn't think we would get back this soon. We didn't think we would get to build the careers we have here and the time that we have. And now we're not going anywhere. So
I understand what you're saying about wanting to, tell a more holistic story. Nobody picked up your pitch for Elmo and just freezer full of cash, huh?
Oh, no, we have some like real dark Elmo stories on the back burner, and they've never taken them from us.
Jakob Wheeler, last but certainly not least, tell us about how you got into journalism and what kept you in.
Cool, thanks. But first, I hope we talk about Elmo at least a couple times during this webinar. Let's make it circuitous. It's really a great honor to be on this webinar with all of you. So many stellar names who I know. I have such great respect for you and your publications and your work. So thanks, and thanks to Sam and the League of Even Voters. Yeah, my path, and you might hear my kids in the background. I apologize. Home with them today. My path is a little untraditional. I started the Glen Arbor Sun when I was 18 years old, just out of high school, about to head off to the University of Michigan. And it was really just an opportunity to have a small town community paper and tell stories about a pretty fascinating town that had a lot of visibility and local characters, local businesses. It was meant as a way to help pay for college. I never dreamed that 27 years later it would still be rolling, but it did. I think a lot of us could speak to this, but as the spotlight, really the global spotlight on Leelanau County fell upon us and we became known. Our region is going through a lot of changes, and it's led to fascinating coverage, fascinating stories, important questions about how much to develop, how many people to welcome in, how much to preserve, and that's one of the reasons I think I've stayed in this. I did a lot of traveling in my 20s. After University of Michigan, I lived in Denmark and then later Guatemala. And for me, what fascinated me about journalism, I guess, Jillian mentioned storytelling, and I feel the same. I speak of journalism and reporting and kind of storytelling in the same breath as a way. And I've always been fascinated by meeting amazing people and telling their stories here, there, and all over the world. That's led to a couple of books I've written as well about Guatemala. But again, what I find most fascinating and what I love about my work in journalism here at home in Leelanau County and with students at NMC is just telling fascinating stories about people, many of whom have to be really creative to move here and find work and to make a living. Oftentimes they leave their 3-letter degrees behind because they choose a place over a career. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of our communities and the stories we tell about our communities. Yeah.
I'll open this up to the whole group. I love what you said there, Jakob. That's it's really important. The people and their stories here in our community. What goes into deciding what's a story versus, we all make decisions every day about what we're going to cover, perhaps more importantly, what we're not going to cover. So who wants to jump in here? What goes into your thinking when you're deciding, yeah, this is something I need to tell my audience about?
I can start. We have kind of a different model as more, the Express is more arts and entertainment, lifestyle, human interest type of thing. And we also have themed issues. So unlike a regular newspaper, each of our papers weekly has a theme to it. So a lot of that direction happens just from having that theme. Like we just did a big hiking and biking issue. So pretty much every story in there is connected in one way or the other. And we covered 13 counties. So I know a lot of folks here write in lots of, different areas. So there's almost no shortage of idea and opportunity, even in the winter when sometimes I'm like, is anything happening? But there usually is something happening. But for us, it's kind of, we try to do a mix. It's almost like not quite a formula, but in each paper, kind of have, maybe some event-based things that are happening, interviews with musicians or speakers, something that's focused on a local person or business. We do a lot of restaurant features, new business features, and anything that's usually focused around somebody really interesting. Like we just did a story about Chris Roxburgh, that's hard to say, who's a local diver and photographer and does amazing work. And that it's been like one of our most viewed stories and most interacted with Facebook posts because people are just fascinated by the cool things people do. And then we try to get in, something a little newsier. It's harder for us being a weekly to be on top of the news in the same way that a daily or an online paper can. So we kind of have to lay the groundwork and think ahead, like, okay, this is a bigger story that we can work on for a couple of weeks and it won't be, already told by 7 different outlets by the time it comes out for us. So we try to balance, I would say, those different pieces of the puzzle to make sure, if somebody's picking up our paper, they're getting a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different types of stories when they read.
Yeah. Mardi Link, I want to ask you, because as enterprise reporter, I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that means that you have some degree of autonomy about what you cover versus, say, a reporter who is having an editor say, you're going to the courthouse and you're doing this today, and you're talking to sources and deciding from there what kinds of things are going to be stories for you. Is that correct? And how do you go through that process?
Yeah, I think that is really the definition of enterprise. Is most of the stories originate. I originate the ideas, or the idea for the story comes from the reporter rather than an assignment, or I don't specifically have a beat really. But I do have a pretty great network of sources. So I get ideas from my sources, but I used to question, I used to think I was kind of esoteric and interested in things that the general public was not interested in. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I don't question that news sense as much because when I follow that and when I write a story about it, I see that other people are interested in those same topics too, even if it seemed odd or quirky or unusual or unbelievable. And I think that is one of the things that joins us all as readers and consumers of local news and producers of local news, is that we're interested. We want to know these things. And so if I'm curious about something, I know that our readers are probably curious about it too. But sometimes my story ideas come from maybe a weekend brief news item that I read somewhere. For example, a few years ago, I think it was not last summer, but the summer before, a guy crashed his airplane near Beaver Island. And we ran a little police blotter news item on it. Well, I was really curious about how that happened. I got a hold of the guy, I called him, and it turned out he crashed that plane 7 times in 7 days as he flew it to northern Michigan from California. And so I called every single small airport manager at the places where he crashed, interviewed them, called the police who responded to these crashes. And then I talked with him, and he kept a diary and took selfies while he was flying this plane across the country. And he shared some of those diary entries with me. So if I hadn't been curious about how it was that a guy almost, basically almost drowned when he crashed his plane near Beaver Island, and just by coincidence, President Biden was visiting Antrim County at the time. So that kind of added, a little bit of a rollicking detail to the story. But yeah. I sort of try to do that, take something that might seem minor and build it into, a larger story that encompasses many other voices. And I thoroughly enjoy doing that.
Watergate started with a routine arraignment, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. David Zeman, have you found that to be the case where it's the simple thing and the question that's asked afterward that turns into a much bigger deal?
Yeah. I think what Marty's hitting on is really important, particularly for smaller papers, but even at large dailies. As well, I don't want to beat up on Gannett repeatedly, but the ability to have time to follow your curiosity about something, no reporter expects that they'll be given unlimited time just to follow their fancy and all that. But to have the time to make some calls, to not have to be putting up 2 or 3 little quickie headlines to get X number of hits and audience and so forth, is something that's so valuable and is expensive too, right? I mean, if Marty or any other reporter is spending 2 or 3 days, and sometimes you spend 2 or 3 days looking into something and it's just a plane crash. It's not that crazy story that you came up with. Sometimes you go down rabbit holes, sometimes you go down blind alleys, but being in an organization where you have the time to trust your news judgment, and when you've worked in the industry for a while and you start doing really good stuff, the more you do that, the more that you get the trust of your editors and so forth to go off on something a little bit strange or improbable or whatever. And I just think that that's a really important thing to talk about when you're talking about local news, and when you're talking about the pressures that all newspapers are under to produce a certain level of audience and so forth. And so that's a little bit of something that's gotten lost in the last couple decades, I think.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
On our end at the enterprise, I know it's sort of a cliche, but we really do view ourselves as the watchdogs in the community. We spend a lot of time and resources covering government bodies, whether it's county, township, our local school boards, because they're not going to get that information on what's happening unless we provide it to them. So we take that very seriously, that we have to let people know what's going on in their government bodies, because it has a big impact on them. And it became clear to me a few years ago, speaking to a group, and most of them were retired and went away for the winter time. And they said, you got to understand how important your coverage is for us, because we're far away from home and decisions are being made that will impact us on a day-to-day basis when we come back to our summer home. So it's very important we continue to write that hard news, keep that coverage in front of the public, but yet then still provide the sports coverage and the features and the people news that people want to read as well. So we have that juggling act going on every week. And how do we allocate our resources to get all that coverage?
Victoria, we're talking, we're hearing this conversation about the roles our different news outlets have. And for GTB News, I would imagine, a large part of it is informing tribal citizens, tribal members. But I suppose some of it too is representing to the outside community as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So our main focus is providing that information to our members in a culturally significant way. Talking about those hard issues that Indigenous people face on a daily, but also giving this face to our people in general, to the outside public, to the non-native public, of these are important issues to us, and we should be talking about them more outside of just in our little tiny community, right? So it definitely gives a face to who GTB is and what we represent and what we're looking to progress to.
Yeah. Jakob, I wonder, when you're working with students especially, what are they coming in with? Because there's the media we see, and there's sort of the loud voices in the media landscape. And then there's the media, it sounds like we're all talking about, which is a little bit different. So I'm wondering if when you're working with students, do you have to correct assertions, or are you working to kind of lay out the landscape for them of this is what this job is really about versus what your impression might be, or are they already there?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to answer the question a couple of different ways. I mean, one of the first questions I asked student journalists at NMC who want to join the White Pine Press is, what stories are we the adults, we the professional journalists, what are we not covering? What's relevant to you as a 19, 20, 21-year-old? And one at a community college that you're not seeing. This is your nation, your world, and yet what are we not telling that's relevant to you? And what are the means and methods by which you consume news that we're not telling, that we're not part of? Obviously there are new apps developing by the day by which especially young people consume news, and it's hard for those of us who are a little older to keep up with that. So I asked them that, what are we not covering that we ought to? I think in terms of one of the things I can offer them at the White Pine Press is everyone wants to tell their story and write in the first person and have their soapbox. But one of the things that we need to keep explaining to student journalists and also ourselves is, the best stories are when you find dynamic other characters who you can quote, who can tell the story better than you, the writer, can. Reported stories are better than editorials, essentially.
Yeah, Jillian Manning, I see you nodding.
Yes, I mean, and that's something I feel like is sometimes a struggle. I mean, for me personally, is I will have an opinion, and sometimes I go in with an opinion and it is rattled by the time I have finished a story, which is really good. It's good for me. It's good for everybody. But it is interesting, I think, covering something that maybe you personally don't agree with or don't participate with, and trying to like make that connection. And I think that's, especially in our communities, something that's really important, is that we can make those connections between different sides or whatever it might be, different viewpoints, because if we're not figuring out how those connections exist, nobody's going to be making them on Facebook. You're not going to be probably talking about it at the water cooler. We're kind of one of those last opportunities to show that there is middle ground and that there are different viewpoints that might have validity and interest to people.
We have some questions coming in from folks who are listening in, but before we get to them, I want to jump on that idea of opinion for a second. I sometimes have joked with people when they say, the media all thinks one way, or they're all in league to do this, that nobody's ever seen a newsroom try to order pizza on election night. We can't agree on topping. There's no way we could conspire with each other. But I'm curious where you all think the role of opinion comes in, and the balance between your personal feelings on an issue and your role as a journalist, because there's been a lot of conversations in the industry about this spectrum of complete objectivity, and I'm going to pretend like I don't have any opinion at all, to no, just say your opinion out loud, get it out of the way so your audience knows where you're coming from, and all viewpoints in between. So anybody want to weigh in on that, where you see that role, and how maybe you personally juggle those things?
I'll take a little stab at that. My answer is somewhat tangential, but I know that when I was a book author and I was out there representing my books, you couldn't get me on TV or the radio or in public enough. I mean, that's how you sell books, is you make a connection with the audience, and people have to know that your book exists in order to read it. So you talk to reviewers, you go on stage, you're interviewed. I was, at the National Writer Series a couple of times as an interviewer and an interviewee. It's absolutely just the opposite in my job at the Record Eagle. Because I covered some pretty important national stories like the Antrim election, the Whitmer kidnap trial, I've been asked to go on some primetime news shows, and I've always said no, because the story is not us. We are not the story. We are the conduit to the story. But I think the more focus that goes on the individual reporter, the less that our readers are engaged and interested in the news that we are bringing them. And so I guess that would be my criticism of maybe perhaps journalism in general, is that I think too many reporters, and some of them good reporters, have forgotten that and have become media personalities in their own right. And I have a problem with that.
Tell the story, don't be the story.
Yeah. I know that's old school, but that's,
Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, everybody has their own opinions, their own beliefs. And so it's difficult not to let that come into your writing. Just because it's human nature, you have feelings. So we have to be really careful, and the editors have to be very diligent in making sure we're not getting swayed one way or the other. And believe it or not, people will try to sway you to their direction when you talk to them. So that also is human nature. So we really have to look at what we're writing, who we're talking to, and make sure we have a balanced story without our own personal opinions coming into it. One of the big changes, I think, in our industry in the last few years is the difficulty in differentiating between news and opinion. Our opinion page is opinion. And when people read that, they have a harder time now of separating that from our news content, even as far as letters to the editor. They'll read the letters to the editor and think that's the newspaper's opinion when it's not. So it's been very difficult. And it's why at the Enterprise, the last election, we did not do endorsements. We did not do political endorsements. And many newspapers across the country have stopped doing that because readers have a hard time differentiating an endorsement on the opinion page versus your news coverage. So that's been a big change, a big shift, I believe, in our industry of there's so much opinion out there now that it's hard to keep track or keep that out of our news reporting.
As a former political reporter, I spent some time saying to sources, no, that was written down the hall. I don't have anything to do with that. Jakob, you raised your hand.
Yeah, no, I think one of the reasons I'm most excited that we're having this discussion about local news is I think that one of the great opportunities with local news in communities where we're known by communities is, I mean, we've seen this very, very sad kind of partisan rancor in national news, where people choose their national news sources, their cable news, their Fox, their MSNBC, whatever it is, based on their beliefs, and they're looking to places that reaffirm their beliefs. But I think that we can avoid that to a large degree in local news if we're capturing the voices, the distinct voices of our community, speaking to our community, for our community, with our community. We're speaking about people, we're telling stories about people, the local janitor, the local school bus driver, the local sheriff, people who are known in the community, and thus be more trusted and be more authentic, capturing the local voices in ways that are more difficult for a national or even international news outlet. And I think that we've got to keep that in mind, that we can really be that trusted, reliable source because we're local, because we're so close and local and well known.
I think all of us have a story about what we sort of refer to as parachute journalism, where a national outlet shows up in our community and tells us all about ourselves, and often gets it wrong. Anybody want to chime in on that?
I can definitely agree with that, especially coming even within our own little tight community and coming in as, say, you guys as outsiders, it kind of feels that same way sometimes. So we have to kind of distinguish ourselves, who we are, so people telling us who we are is kind of interesting because we're so intertwined. We're such a tight-knit community, and that involves, the Northern Express, the Record Eagle, the Leelanau Enterprise. This is our home. So we're also interconnected to our readers because this is where our heart is.
Anybody else want to jump in on that before I move on to a listener question? Thank you, Victoria.
I was gonna, go ahead, Jillian.
No, I was just going to say I was on sort of the other side. It was, 2021 when there was the slave trade Snapchat happening at Central High School, and I'm a Central grad. And I teamed up with another alum, and we were working together. I think it was a little bit earlier than that, but working together to get a diverse book fair going because we couldn't make any changes to the curriculum. And then I got called, I can't remember, I think it might have been New York Times, and now should have been paying better attention, but they wanted me to do background. And it's is Traverse City racist? And I'm like, well, yeah, some people are. And everywhere you go, that's the case. I don't know what to, but they were so clearly looking to be Traverse City is the worst place in the planet. And I was like, for some people, yeah, there are some very bad people doing bad things, but there are also good people doing good things. And I could just tell there was the working of an angle. The story didn't end up being written ever, at least that I ever saw, or at least I was never quoted in it, but it was really interesting to feel that pressure of somebody else's preconceived notions writing about us and something that we were writing about in our own local journalism and had a much better pulse on than them coming to in my view, it felt like they were trying to get this salacious headline. And I was like, we are a much more complex place than what you're trying to reduce us to.
Yeah. David?
Well, we're sort of a hybrid organization, and a lot of us come from local papers. And so in a way, we parachute all the time within Michigan, right? I mean, if you live if you live in the Metro Detroit area, you tend to rely on your sources from Southeast Michigan and so forth. And same thing with Grand Rapids or anywhere else. And we try to do a really good job of making sure that reporters go into any community, and really, almost always our stories from outside of the metro areas are our most popular stories. Not only because we have a lot of readers in Northwest Michigan, but because so many people have fascinations about that part of the country, or about the UP and so forth. And I just think it requires a real humility about your assumptions, and making sure that it's not a 3 or 4 hour just touchdown, but several days spent. And obviously several days is not the same as living and working and being in a community for years and years. But it's really difficult to do, but it's also some of the most rewarding journalism to do, is to just give yourself over to what your preconceptions were, and challenge them, and be willing to be so wrong about what you thought the story was going to be when you first arrived at a community.
It can be a humbling exercise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So anybody else before I jump ahead?
I was just going to say, I think it's frustrating for, to be in a locality where you've covered a story from start to finish, or from start to middle, and then suddenly the story blows up, and the Washington Post or the New York Times either shows up in your community or calls you and leaves you a message to say things like, could you please explain to me what a preliminary hearing is? Ooh. Or could you please explain to me how to contact this person? And I mean, it can be frustrating to put so much labor in developing your sources and understanding an issue and spending hours in court, and somebody from a larger market wants to just have that handed to them. And I tend to say no to those requests. It's also frustrating to have your work appear in bigger markets without anyone saying that the Record Eagle was the first person to break this story. It would be nice to get that nod, but we rarely do.
I will tell you that whenever there's something that served me pretty well is whenever there's big news somewhere in the country and it flashes up on CNN, I always try to go to the local news source there first. Get online, go, okay, there's this story breaking in Atlanta. What does the Journal-Constitution have to say about it, before I start just worrying about the flyover stuff that I'm getting from national sources? I think that can be helpful to us. I'm thinking of a scene in the movie. I think it's the movie Airplane, the spoof of airport, disaster films. And the plane, there's trouble on the plane, and a whole bunch of reporters all run at once into the bank of payphones, and the bank of payphones tips over. And they're all racing to get the story back first. And it comes from this era when journalism was super competitive, and we were all trying to beat each other to the same story. It feels like, I'm willing to be wrong on this, but it feels like we're past that era now. And I hear a lot more talk about collaboration. I know we're talking about that at IPR a lot. This question is from Eric, and I think it's an interesting one. Do the panelists have any ideas on how to encourage more collaboration between media entities to fund expensive legal actions to compel compliance with Michigan's Freedom of Information Act, to get information from the government out into public? Any of us talking about that in our newsrooms?
Sure, we talk about it all. Are you talking about like the frustration with the quality of Michigan's Freedom of Information Act?
I think it's more, maybe. I mean, I don't want to put words in Eric's mouth, but it does seem like that might be part of it. But also, is there a role? Are we stronger together when it comes to the cost and time it takes to compel the government to release records and information?
We believe so at Bridge. I mean, we often team up with other organizations to do that type of work. I mean, whether it's getting something from the governor's office or the attorney general's office, or really the two worst organizations on earth for coughing up information, MSU and the University of Michigan. There's a limit to any newsroom's budget, and the smaller the newsroom, the more you are at the mercy of organizations to do what they're supposed to do, which is to share the public's records, which are not their records as they seem to think it is, but the public's. And we've had problems with Whitmer's office, certainly with as I'm sure Marty would agree, with Nessel's office on some records. I think it's really important to I mean, we just did this recently with the News and the Free Press to try to get more records out of MSU after the horrible shooting there. And they can just, they have a zillion lawyers, and they can, and we have a limited amount of budget for this sort of thing. And so it's important to work on that. It's important. We work on an organization trying to get the public records laws changed, and there's some really odd couples with, with us and the Mackinac Center, which, say what you will about the Mackinac Center, they're doing God's work on trying to get the public records laws improved. And I think that benefits everyone in the state, regardless of their political ideology.
Yeah. The Michigan Press Association, in full disclosure, I'm on that board. We spend a lot of resources, both time and money, working with the legislative bodies on open meetings, freedom of information, and so on. And we also work with member newspapers to help them work through the process. So it's a very, very vital service that the association can provide. And, it's very, very expensive, and dues alone cannot provide that kind of coverage. So we rely on donations from other news organizations, newspapers, and companies around the state to help in those efforts to, Michigan is one of the few, if not the only state that doesn't require freedom of information from their legislator and governor, which is ridiculous. I mean, at that top level of the state, those should be the people most open and free of sharing the documents. So it's an effort that's going to continue to go on, and it's going to take all of us to continue pounding on it to assure openness in government.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Whack-a-mole. It is a complete whack-a-mole. I mean, we could be filing lawsuits in every single courtroom. I think, I think Nessel's office has huge improvements to make in terms of transparency and records and reading the law. And I also think the legislature has done a lot of talking about the importance of transparency and very little action. And so I'm glad that I hope that all of us keep focused on this issue and impress them on it, because if we don't, things will just stay the status quo.
Absolutely. And just a little plug, the Record Eagle and Michigan Press are hosting Attorney General Nessel next Friday in Traverse City. Interesting to see what she has to say, and what kind of questions we pose to her.
Have a notebook full of questions for her, I would imagine.
You have to pre-register. So anybody who's listening that wants to attend, pre-register so that you can be here.
Do I have a memory of legislation that was aimed at breaking down some of those information walls and requiring the legislature and governor to comply with FOIA and open meetings, but FOIA presumably?
Yeah, and and it hopefully will get revived again this session as well. Republican leadership in the legislature, I can't remember which chambers, maybe one of you remember better, always sort of stood in the way, but there's bipartisan support, and there are legislators on both sides. I'm thinking of Mick Broom in the UP is a Republican who's really fought hard. Moss, a Democrat in Southeast Michigan, really fought hard for this sort of stuff. And the governor, Whitmer and Nessel are these self-proclaimed, transparent government candidates, and they were in 2018. And they can say, yeah, we'll do it when the legislature does it. But they, when they sort of voluntarily release some documents and not others at times, but there's nothing that's preventing the Whitmer administration from just implementing, making themselves open to the Public Records Act, as Marty indicated, on their own. They don't have to wait for the legislature, but they're waiting for the legislature. And it just, I do think, my assumption is that with both of those women, that they believe in transparent government. I'm not seeing them as evil or malicious or whatever. But by gosh, I just think they have higher priorities right now, and they've passed a lot of legislation. You could say they're the most successful, 3 months of a party in maybe history in Michigan, the last 3 months. And I think they'll get to it. And I just hope they get to it now when they don't have an excuse to say no.
Here's a question from Nancy, and it's about statewide coverage on issues that have an impact locally. How do local outlets cover statewide news as it applies to Leelanau or the Grand Traverse region? And I'll read just a little more here. Nancy says the state's two largest dailies have been so slimmed down. For example, when we read Bridges' coverage of the fact that 83 counties may not plan to enforce recent gun safety legislation, we wondered why this wasn't a huge statewide story. That's news, not opinion, but it's also a story we haven't seen covered elsewhere. I was pleased to see that Leelanau County wasn't one of the 83, but many stories get reinterpreted as opinion when they're just fact. So when there's something that happens statewide, how do each of us take that and try to make it relevant to our local audiences? Or do we just lean on a statewide story and say, there it is?
I think we need to have that big story, but also how it interconnects to our community, how it affects our community, the local community, because some of those issues in Detroit or in larger metropolitan areas may be viewed a little bit differently than in a small town, Traverse City. And they're obviously going to be struggling with different issues than what they would be struggling in the metropolitan area. So I think honing it down to how it affects our local community is really important.
Yeah. John, did I see you start in on that?
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. We don't have the resources, personnel or space to run a lot of state, national, world news. We are hyper local. So if there's an issue that relates directly to Leelanau County, we'll cover it. But it's got to have a local connection for us to pursue it.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say we're the same way. Everything is very local. I mean, we have our 13 counties, but anything in that is kind of fair game. And this is a little tangential, but we recently updated our letters to the editor policy, asking for letters to be focused on local issues, because we were getting, I love Trump, I hate Trump, I love Biden, I hate Biden. And it was repetitive in a way that, wasn't really discourse about our region or anything like that. And it was also the fact checking of some of those things. It wasn't our area of expertise, but it's been a very interesting, some people are really happy that those letter to the editor section is like in line with what our paper does. Like it can be something like, school shootings and like what Traverse City would be doing about that. There can be these connections to these local and national subjects, but we've also had people that are like, why are you doing this? You're censoring us. And we say, no, like that's definitely not our idea. There are so many papers in our region and in the state that do a great job covering national and, just bigger stories. That's not our area of expertise. And we can't do that well. I'm the only like full-time dedicated editorial staff person, on this team. And it's just not something that we can do well. And if we can't do it well, we probably shouldn't be doing it. And so it's interesting. I think there is always that local connection to a national issue, whatever it is, and it's finding that kind of hidden lead, that like thread that connects them. That's what we can do versus what a national outlet can do.
Mardi Link, it feels like sometimes you're covering issues in the opposite direction. You are a local reporter covering the Whitmer kidnapping case and Antrim County voting issues, or things that have statewide interest or sometimes even national interest. Do you feel like your job is to speak to those broader audiences, or are you still focused on writing it a little bit differently than other media is going to cover it?
Well, I wanted to thank Nancy for the question and say that I think she's completely right. That is a huge story, and it should be much more thoroughly covered, and certainly also by the paper that I work for. So thanks, Nancy, for asking that question. And I would say that I try to cover some statewide issues. Last weekend, I had a couple stories on the aging of our prison population and the number of people that serve long sentences, and what that means both socially and financially. Now, granted, none of those prisons are here, and the warden that I interviewed is the warden of Lakeland Prison in Coldwater, hours from our geographical area. But it's our taxes that pay those medical costs for those prisoners who are aging. We have 100 people who are over 80 years old and probably will die while they're incarcerated. Do we want to pay the cost for that? Also, we have people whose crimes were committed up here and who end up serving those long sentences in downstate prisons. So that is, I suppose, somewhat of a local angle. But just because we live here doesn't mean we're not interested in issues that are statewide. Kind of the reverse of that, and I bet the other people on this panel will have some kind of the same mechanism that I have. So I have a couple of open Word documents on my computer with a file name that at someday I will write a story on, but I just keep kind of stuffing stuff in there. And one of those open file folders is on the number of commissions, panels, government studies, all of those things that have zero representation north of US 10. So, I mean, that is kind of maybe a way that I can take the state to task for not considering our region more. I mean, eventually that story will appear in the paper. I'm still waiting for more ammo, for that. But I think that just because we live in this and love this area doesn't mean we're not interested in the entire state of Michigan. So I try to cover some statewide issues.
And we're staying away from the extremely polarizing question of where does up north begin? You said US 10. I'm going to go with that.
Right.
Speaking of polarization, here's a question from Tom. How does our current high level of political polarization affect local journalism? Because, people say the media, and oftentimes when I see my friends saying that, they're talking about Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or something that local media. How does the high level of political polarization affect us in our jobs?
Was that directed to me? I'm sorry.
Anybody
Okay.
wants to jump in? Go ahead, John.
Yeah, it certainly does. The polarization nationwide is just gets more extreme every year, and it's filtered all the way down to county, village, township level. So it makes it more difficult to try to stay in the middle of all that divisiveness. We know what had been happening at our county board level over the last few years. It was very politically divided. I think that has eased off a little bit, which I'm hoping gets things back to normal. But the political divisiveness certainly impacts all of us at every level.
Yeah. Jakob Wheeler, you feeling that at the Glen Arbor Sun?
Yeah, I think the political division is everywhere for sure. It cycles down, as John said. But I do think, and I tried to touch on this earlier, I think that we have a great opportunity in local news, that it's easier for us in a way than the national news if we can really understand and capture the distinct voice of our community, the voices, the tone, the cadence, what people wear, the coffee shops where they are, feature the people that you see every day. It can be a way to to reinform and build on that trust that needs to be there between the population and journalism. That I think we have an opportunity because we're so local, and we should build on that. But it's hard. I mean, we're all covering stories that either they're nakedly political or they're informed by politics, whether it's perspectives on schools or masking or what's taught in schools, which of course is now part of the larger political narrative. I think it's always helpful too, when we're quoting a source, when we're featuring someone, to understand what their perspective is and what informs their perspective. Ask them, what do they watch? What do they read? Where are these perspectives from? If someone's speaking at a school board meeting about their perspective on sexuality of teenagers and what's being taught or not taught at schools, understanding where that person gets their perspective, their opinion.
Yeah, I mean, trying to channel disagreement or irritation into curiosity, right? That maybe when we hear something that bothers us, if we can find a way to be curious about it rather than knee-jerk angry about it, we might all be a little better off. I don't know. Anybody else on political polarization and how it affects our local news gathering? Okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's a new reality, and with every news source, you have to build trust, and the only way to do that is to report accurately. I mean, I have had people say that they would criticize, quote unquote, the media, and then say, "Oh, but I don't mean you." Well, the paper that I work for, and I am the media. Yes, you pretty much do mean me. But I don't think it's just this political divisiveness. It's also just kind of this simmering general sense of anger and dissatisfaction also. I mean, there's a level of discourse that, I mean, I'm sure we all get the emails. And some of the emails that I get, I did not get those a year or two ago. So I mean, I suppose you could reduce that to politics, but I think it's just this general sense of people are angry, and they're going to share it.
And I wonder, you said, but not you.
Yeah.
And I wonder if as local news outlets, we have an opportunity to be known, because people, I think it's harder to be mad at somebody or something well versus an abstraction, right? I can be mad about CNN and think that everybody responsible for that story was an idiot. But if it's the local reporter at my local place and I know them, I might temper my view a little more and be able to say, I didn't like that story and here's why, and maybe we can talk about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, we were talking before we started the webinar about the ticker comments. And my husband is a writer for the ticker, and people will call him out and be like, Craig Manning is a blah, 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 and like insult him. And I'm like, oh, would you like to now engage in not a fist fight, but a word fight? And I don't, of course, but it's fascinating. I'm like, you could run into him at the grocery store. And like, I mean, some of those are burner accounts or whatever that people use to hide behind, but some of them are real people. And I look them up and I'm like, I've seen now, not only are you comfortable saying that, but you aren't giving any benefit of the doubt to somebody in your community, somebody that you could know. And it is weird. We've even had, people we have, unlike Marty, we've been put in the media, even by like extended family members who are very much on one side of politics. They're like, oh, well, you're part of it and the conspiracy. And like you said, yeah, ordering a pizza, like how could we all be in a conspiracy? It just doesn't make any sense. But there's the vitriol. I think one of the questions, Ed, you had told us to think about ahead of time was what has changed in the time you've been doing this work. And for me, that's the biggest thing, is just the anger, the distrust. And I feel like for some people and some outlets that might be valid, but just that it's been applied so broadly to anybody that's trying to tell stories is mind-boggling to me.
I think sometimes, and I've told my students this, when I took them to Flint during the height of the water crisis, and we were parachuting in, talk about being a human, being a human first and a good listener first and a journalist after that, right? I mean, connect with them on a human level, empathize with their pain if they're in a difficult situation. When Russia invaded Ukraine 14 months ago, I think I wrote a story about a local Ukrainian woman on the border between Traverse City and Leelanau County, and she had been interviewed by, I think, a TV station a day before, and they, as what happens with TV news, her perspective was boiled down to like a 10-second soundbite, and she was also upset that we weren't going to close the skies and become Ukraine's Air Force. So she was just upset. But it came down to me spending a couple hours with her and empathizing and talking and listening and saying, no, I do want to put your perspective, locally, how painful it is to be Ukrainian, but also internationally, what you really wish would happen, what the United States would do. But being a voice for her to overcome what was her anger at the media, right?
Yeah. Anybody else?
I think in this business, like most anything else, it's about relationship building. You got to have a good relationship with your readers, your market. The letters to the editor is a perfect example. People will blast you without ever speaking with you about the issue. And I try to respond to a lot of them. And if you talk to them, most of them calm down and invite them to meet. 99% will not meet with you to talk about the issue. But after they meet with you, they realize we're not these nasty people conspiring against the world. So I encourage everyone in our team here to meet with people, sit down and talk with them, find out what they're really angry about or what their concern is. And of course, with our news team, you want relationships, but you got to be careful you don't go too far with your sources. You got to keep that professional distance. But the better relationships in the community, the more trusted you will be, and the better things are going to be for you.
Here's a question I'd like each of us to address, but John, we're going to start with you, and you'll see why when I get to the end of the question. I'm gonna read it. This is from an anonymous attendee. Newspapers are a dying industry is something we're being told, yet we've seen stories about how hyperlocal newspapers are doing relatively okay compared to the big national newspapers, exactly for the reasons that Jakob mentioned. People feel able to trust their local news sources, perhaps more than mainstream media, and or reading a humanized story about your neighbor means it's less political in some ways, etc. So for each of us, and we'll start with the COO of a group of community newspapers here, insofar as you're able to answer, what are you seeing in your publications? Are you doing okay? Are you growing, or are you seeing downsizing? John?
No, we're certainly not downsizing. We're doing very well, and part of that is our hyper local focus. Our newspapers dying depends. Some of the major metropolitan areas, they're dying by suicide, to be honest. I spent time, as David did, with some of the major corporations, and you look at what's happened to some of our papers right here in Michigan that were Gatehouse or Gannett. They've stripped them down to nothing. Most of them no longer have an office. They have very few people, almost no local reporting. So if you take away your office and all your reporting, certainly you're going to struggle, and the end is near. But if you focus on giving people what they want, consistently and fairly, we're doing okay. And that'll be our lifeblood of giving people local news, covering our local markets, both on hard news and features about the people and places that make this a special place to be. And I mentioned earlier, that's the approach of the owner of our company, is he's buying these small markets because he believes strongly in local journalism. He wants to keep them alive. There's studies that show that if a small community loses their newspaper, the political divide just gets bigger because there's nobody to bring them back into center point. So some newspapers are dying. Many of us are doing very well. And if we focus on our markets, we'll continue to do well.
Yeah, Victoria, let me put the question to you. How are things going at GTB News?
They're actually going really well. We're in this pivotal moment in how we communicate. So we're enhancing our various ways how we communicate. So it's not just print material anymore. It's mass notifications, it's social media engagement, YouTube. I mean, we're really expanding in within the Grand Traverse Band communications department. I think me being so young, I'm giving that fresh kind of look at things and how we can get our voice out there and get these stories out there so people can have those to expand their mind a little bit more. So, and it's not just, we're having kids wanting to know about these stories now. They're interested. So as soon as you start grabbing those attentions of all those different demographics, it expands some things for you. So we're expanding in GTB News world. So I'm super excited.
Yeah, we're trying to do the same at IPR. I know, one of the conversations we've had is we want to keep doing our FM radio work really well. But just today, we've launched a podcast with our feature reporting in it, which is something we've never had before for an audience that maybe has never been exposed to that kind of reporting from us before. So I think we're all always looking for new ways to talk about what we're doing and to share our work with the public. Jakob Wheeler, let me go to you. How's the Glen Arbor Sun doing? How are things going in your corner of the industry?
Yeah, no, they're going fine. Thanks. I think, John alluded to the tragedy of news deserts in some parts of Michigan and a lot of places in the United States. But I think that in this corner of our region, in Leelanau County, in the Grand Traverse area, we're really blessed to have a citizenry that will pay for good journalism, good storytelling, good reporting. We have a lot of fantastic newspapers and magazines and radio and online news in this area. I think we really have an opportunity collectively to be a catalyst for other regions of the nation to show this is how it can be done, so long as, citizens will support us, will read us. Yeah.
Mardi Link, I see the Record Eagle getting out into the community a lot. How are things going there, and insofar as you're able to answer?
Yeah, the Record Eagle, I think, is solid. We're owned by a company called CNHI, which owns, I think, about another 100, maybe 125 community newspapers around the United States. Very supportive of the work that we do. And I think partly we're solid because more than some newspapers, we are funded by subscriptions as much as we are by advertising. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't love to have your advertising. I'm not saying that, but because we have so many supportive readers, we've been able to build our subscriber base to, help fund the paper, as opposed to just only having that, having that advertising income. But also we've started to do more collaborating, and I really like that idea. Like, we have 2 Report for America reporters. We've talked about sometimes our reporters go on IPR to talk about our stories. So I hope to see more of that. And I think that's how local news survives. It isn't that bank of reporters running to the phones anymore, like you suggested. It is much more collaborative, I think. And we are blessed to live in a region that values good journalism.
David Zeman, you've got a nonprofit news organization that you're editing. How are things going there?
They're going really well, and the main reason they're going well, hopefully our reporting is contributing to it, is that morons like me aren't in charge of the business side. Our CEO, until recently, he's in this about to retire. John Bebo was actually one of my reporters when I was an investigative reporter with the Detroit, or investigative editor with the Detroit Free Press. And he went on and got his MBA and is really really became a really effective person with the philanthropic community, with the business community, and started again with us as well, sort of a reader subscription thing. We now have someone who's the CEO who came from the Knight Foundation, Katie Locker, who is very well known within the philanthropic community. But I mean, our goal has always been to to, be self-sufficient and so forth. I mean, we love the philanthropic support. We love the fact that we have a founder, Phil Power, who gives the organization $1 million every year. And if, he gets hit by a milk truck tomorrow, it's still going to go on to 2030, all of that is great. But we go on the assumption that, philanthropies maybe tire, looking for new things or whatever. And the Phil and Kathy Power money won't be forever. So we need to become sustainable and really building our, really building our reader engagement and our reader subscription and so forth is really important. And that's becoming a larger and larger portion of our overall revenue. And it's allowed us to continue to add reporters and editors and so forth. And we'll be adding more in the next year or two.
All right. Thank you very much. Jillian, how's the Northern Express these days?
Good. And it's been especially interesting to watch just in the last year that I've been working as editor, coming out of the pandemic squeeze. Our paper in that time was maybe 24 pages, where it used to be 36, 48. And we're making our way back to that, which is really encouraging and wonderful, especially in the summer months. And we're in such an interesting kind of, our family is the Express, the Ticker, the Leelanau Ticker, and the TC Business News. And each of them does something different in terms of content and something different in terms of distribution. We're a physical free paper. TCBN is a subscription or, pay, I think it's $4 or something when you pick it up. And then obviously the Ticker and the Leelanau Ticker are online free kind of dailies. And so I think having that mix for us as a company really helps, because we can see where people are going, what they're liking, what they're not liking, how they're interacting just from a business perspective with us and with advertising too. So we get to learn a lot from each different paper. Our sales reps, kind of do a lot of collaboration to figure out how that's working, how it's not working. And then same for us on the editorial side. But it's nice to see we're able, I just want to have more stories. I want to do more than 5 features. I want 7 features. I want 20. So, that might be a little too much work. 7, we'll stop. 7 to 9 would be fine. But it's exciting to see that just kind of going back to normal over the last year.
Awesome. Okay, we are getting down to the end of our time together, and I want to throw a couple more things at you before we go. Real quick things though. Mary Jo had a fun question for us, which is, what is your favorite movie about the newspaper profession? One of mine is Call Northside 777 with Jimmy Stewart. All right, so who wants to throw out their film recommendations here? Jakob.
Very last scene in the movie Spotlight, the Boston Globe priest abuse scandal. Very last scene.
Who else? What else we got?
I would just echo that whole movie.
Yeah.
Same here. And I can't remember which movie it is, but there's a scene, and I shake my head and laugh about it. There's a scene where the editor and publisher are running and they're trying to stop the press, and the stop the press button's in a lockbox. And it's like, are you kidding me? Where's OSHA? That's not behind a lockbox. It's readily available. So it was a little bit embellished, but humorous point in a movie that's not realistic. So
that movie is The Paper with Glenn Close and Michael.
Yes. Yeah.
And both that and Spotlight, for extremely different reasons, are great depictions of what it's like to work in journalism. Yeah. Anybody else have a journalism movie they want to recommend? All right. As we wrap up here, I'm going to ask each of you, it's 5 years from now. I'm going to put you on the spot, editors and writers and publishers. Write me a headline about the state of the journalism industry 5 years from now, the state of the local news industry 5 years from now. What does the headline say? See, we think about our headlines.
Yeah, I have to come up with some alliteration, right? Like this might take a second.
I think it's a headline that could be written today or next week or last week, and that is that local news breaks national story.
Anybody else want to chime in? Mine is a big 200-point bold, all caps, headline, banner, A1, and it says, "We're still here." I think stories are always going to be important. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for participating today. There were so many great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. What I heard in this conversation is that we love to engage with our audiences. We are here. We are in your community. Talk to us and get to know what's going on in your community through the stories that we're telling. Thanks to Leelanau Indivisible and the League of Women Voters, and Sam, thank you for inviting me to moderate this conversation. I've had a wonderful time this morning. Thank you to all of our panelists, and of course, thanks to all of you who are attending today's webinar. It's been a really important and interesting conversation. So thank you very much. And Sam, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, I just want to tell you how important it is that you guys are here and how much we appreciate what you do. I'm very honored that you're here, and anytime you guys want to have a beer, I'm happy to join you somewhere. And also, Leelanau Indivisible has been highlighting groups that do good work in our county, and that's why I asked you all to do this. And our next meeting is going to be with Laurel Jarris on May 13th, talking about the Poor Farm and how Leelanau County dealt with poverty in the 1900s, but also how we can think about how we can deal with poverty in the future. So have a wonderful day, everybody. We can learn if we choose to from the first people, the first generation principle, protecting our great, 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 great grandchildren's environment. We're borrowing it from them. Have a great day and goodbye.
See you. Thank you.